Welcome to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology Podcast, a podcast hosted by Marcelo Aebi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium. We aim to draw a map of the state of criminology across Europe through the words of contemporary criminologists. How is criminology defined and taught? Which are the main lines of research? Which are the main schools of thought in each country? These and many other questions are answered here by fellow researchers who share their vision on the development of criminology in their countries from its beginnings to the second decade of the 21st century. If you want to know and compare their stories, stay tuned.
Today we are interviewing Pat Mayhew. Pat Mayhew was formerly the Deputy Head of the Crime and Criminal Justice Unit at the Home Office in the United Kingdom, as well as the Director of the Crime and Justice Research Centre at the Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand from 2004 to 2008. She was awarded the Stockholm Prize in Criminology jointly with Ronald Clarke in 2015 in honor of her and Clarke's work on situational crime prevention and opportunity theories, bringing the situation back in the criminological enterprise. She is also an expert on victimization surveys and played a major role in, amongst others, the International Crime Victimization Survey. This interview was partially conducted on the 21st of March 2023 and finalized on the 25th of April 2023. Hello, good afternoon, Pat Mayhew. Welcome to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology Podcast.
Hello, Pat. It's really a pleasure to have you here. And so, as you know, we usually are interested in this podcast is interested in the history of criminology in Europe. And until now, we have interviewed almost all academics. But the United Kingdom has a particularity compared to, not only one compared to the content, many, but we will talk about one in particular. The fact that the Home Office, what is called in other countries the Ministry of Interior, played a major role in the development of criminology. I was reading a couple of days ago the obituary of Leslie Wilkins in The Guardian, and The Guardian said that he raised the interest of for criminology in the UK and then in the US. And you played a major role inside the Home Office. You even developed a theory. You got the equivalent to the Nobel Prize in Criminology, so you are quite unique. And so today we would like to start by asking you how did you arrive to criminology, and how would you define criminology, or do you consider that it was criminology that you were doing? Yeah, general question.
Yes, I would say I'm a criminologist. I came into criminology purely by accident. There's lots of historical accidents in everybody's life. I had been to South America on a social development project, and when I got back, I'd got absolutely no money, and I'd been interviewed by the Civil Service Commission for a research job, and I got turned down. But when I got back with no money, I phoned up, and on the off chance they might have changed their mind, and they had. And that was 1967. So I was allocated to the Home Office. I'd given crime as my major interest, and I managed to get it. I did one paper at university in criminology. There weren't criminology degrees like there are now. I was a sociologist. And I did one paper in criminology, and that was that. So I happened to arrive there at a particularly fortunate time. In fact, I think my career has been marked by a series of strokes of good luck in terms of who I've worked for and the environments I've worked with them in. So I actually arrived at the Home Office slightly before Ron Clarke, and I did all sorts of funny things, escaping from prison and all heaven knows what. Anyway, Ron came with very much a sort of crime prevention agenda, and he looked around for people he'd like to have in his team. And so I began working with him in the very, very end of about 1969 and through the 70s. After that, we parted company a bit because my career path went down the lines of victimisation surveys. For my sins, I have done more victimisation surveys, I think, than I care to remember. But apropos situational crime prevention, the Stockholm Prize linked it very much to a publication of which I was the first author, Crime as Opportunity. And the Stockholm people were very sensitive about making sure that women, especially women, and first authors, especially first authors, were acknowledged. So to be quite honest, I think that's the only reason I got it. It wasn't to do on the basis of my theorising. It was all very, very much Ron's theorising. But I was very much behind it. And we did some very, very snazzy, rather quaint little studies throughout the 70s. And then, of course, he took it with him when he left in 1984 to go to America. Although I've kept in touch with him, obviously, and we've done some joint work together. So going back to the point about the climate in the Home Office, it was indeed a very unusual setup because there wasn't really very much criminology at all in Britain at that time. There was the Cambridge Institute, which had been set up in 1959, I think. And not really very much else. I think there was more of a sort of legal centre at Oxford. So we were given, through a Criminal Justice Act, a great deal of money. And it attracted a lot of talented people into the Home Office, people who were interested in social policy. We had a very enormous budget, which we could use for funding outside research. And therefore, all the academics in universities, as they began to increase in number, were very wedded to us because we were the source of the purse strings. That changed later, and we may get onto that in due course. So one of the perceptions of Home Office research latterly, more recently, is that it was very non-independent, that it was tied to the policy apron. That, in fact, in the 70s, 80s, and even in the early 90s, was simply not true. We were a standalone unit. We weren't embedded in criminal policy divisions, although that is now the case. So we were sort of reluctant civil servants. We saw ourselves as academics rather than civil servants. And there was, what was important in the development of situational crime prevention was that there was a real vacuum of ideas around at that time how to reduce crime. As you know, one of the central tenets of situational crime prevention, which got a lot of criticism, was that don't bother about trying to reform offenders, don't bother try and alleviate social conditions, just get on with stopping the crimes. That fell on very, very fallow ground initially. And it was only really due to Ron's doggedness, and he would just not give way on the idea that you should do what was used to be called social prevention. It was a time, if you can remember, with the Martinson work, Nothing Works. And the other thing that was a real propeller for situational crime prevention was that problem-oriented policing was getting a big foothold in America. And as you know, England policymakers and England academics always look to America for all the best. And so because Herrnstein had made such good inroads with problem-oriented policing, Ron was able to link what he was called situational policing to that, and that got quite a good hearing. And then he expanded it to this notion of situational crime prevention more broadly. And nobody else was coming up with any ideas in terms of policy. So it eventually got reluctantly accepted by administrators.
Unfortunately, the other day we had a slight technical problem, so we will keep the first part that we recorded, and we can start the moment you enter the Home Office, if you want.
Well, at that time it was called the Home Office Research Unit. It very soon after that was renamed as the Research and Planning Unit, and then latterly in 2001 it was renamed yet again. But anyway, that's all boring. I came in 1967. I was a few months prior to Ron Clarke coming. So when I first started work, I worked on all sorts of things which were nothing to do with crime prevention. At the time, it was a very large, very vibrant unit with a very good reputation. And it was at that time very singular in the sense that it was a cadre of criminologists all under one roof. And there were other criminologists, obviously, in universities. At the present time, the situation has changed a great deal. There's no central government research facility such as the research unit was at that time. When Ron came, he came with a very big agenda. Was put into his team. I can't think whether I put myself in it or he put me in it, but it doesn't matter. And of course, he was a tremendous mentor and very, very, very singular in the way he sort of approached research and thought about research. And we started to write about the role of opportunity in crime. Which was one of his very, very big ideas. He didn't believe in changing people. He believed in changing situations. A lot has been written in the 80s, 90s, and even now about situational crime prevention, which it wasn't called initially. It was called physical crime prevention, sort of manipulated by the government. The truth of the matter was that it was a very unpopular approach in the Home Office at the time, and it was only by virtue of Ron's doggedness that he stuck to his guns, and dogged he is. But in fact, it fell on very fallow ground when initially, because people were still very committed to the idea of rehabilitating offenders, root causes of crime, etc. But the climate at the time was also fortunate in one sense, and that was that it was the era of nothing works. Prison doesn't work, rehabilitative programs don't work, policing doesn't work. And so there was a sort of gap for something else. And the other thing that happened was that Herman Goldstein in America was putting forward problem-oriented policing, POP. And of course, everybody in England is terribly in awe of anything that comes over from America. So situational crime prevention and a sort of sub-branch of it, which Ron called situational policing, linked up very well with the idea of problem-oriented approaches. And so it got a wind behind it because of Goldstein that it might not have otherwise done. The other name, which is a name from the past, which I don't know how many people will remember, was Oscar Newman, with his writing on defensible space and how urban design created the conditions for crime. And it was a really bestseller, and it was very, very influential. And again, some of our ideas about design in relation to crime rang a very loud bell in relation to defensible space. So it sort of took off. Ron left for the States in 1984, by which time the sort of crime prevention agenda had been moved across more to what was called the policing research group, I think. I myself I didn't totally give up crime prevention work, but I got very, very heavily involved in the British Crime Survey, which is now not called the British Crime Survey, it's called the Crime Survey for England and Wales, but I'm going to keep calling it for old time's sake the British Crime Survey. So I got embroiled in that. It did have some association with situational crime prevention in that it put the emphasis on sort of crime as it normally was, rather than on, horrendous and rather unusual violent crime. And it put emphasis on victims as agents in the sort of crime process. I would have thought that when you interviewed Jan, I would have thought he would have made the same point about bringing victims back into the arena. I had 37 whole years in the Home Office, although I did have 3 periods away, so it wasn't unremitting, as it were. I went to the National Institute of Justice in Washington in the late 80s, and I went to the Australian Institute of Criminology in the 2001 to 2003.
Just one question about the time when you arrived at the Home Office, 67. Leslie Wilkins had already left?
Yes, he'd already gone. Not long before that, but he had already gone, yes.
Yeah, because it was just at that time. It was when they introduced the laws on drugs. He made that prediction. And his role in this, in the creation of let's say, a situational approach or an opportunity-based approach, because people don't talk a lot about him. Martin Killias, as you know, was very close to Leslie. But usually when I talk, even when I talk with Ron, he never mentions him a lot. It's someone that was there, but before that time.
No, Ron was very close to Leslie Wilkins, and in fact, before he left and upsticked entirely to the United States, he actually had a year at Albany, which I think was where Leslie Wilkins was.
Exactly, yeah.
And so, I mean, Wilkins, I mean, as I recollect, was also into the sort of situational ambience of crime. He left because of his views on the drugs policy, and then he went to the States, as you know. But he was not there when I was there, and I don't recollect him being much talked about. My linkage to him is through Ron, really, because Ron greatly admired him.
Yeah. Okay. That's the role. Yeah. Yeah. I got that impression. I mean, that it was something that happened, long time ago, and so it was not so present. Okay. And I mean, this you mentioned that it was difficult to let's say, impose, to use a word, the situational approach, because it was unpopular. And I think that in many places it remains somehow unpopular. And some of the critiques are completely unjust. I mean, it's like some people seem not to have read what you wrote about that.
Not sure I totally agree that it's still eschewed. It seems to me to be fairly well embedded now. One of the things that happened mid to late 80s was this notion of crime prevention partnerships. So the idea was, you can't leave everything to the police. You need local authorities to be into it, childcare to be in it, the educational system to be in it. And they statutorily required what were called crime prevention partnerships. And there was a huge amount of business, criminological business around these partnerships. But one of the things that happened was that many of these partnerships, when they were faced with doing something about vandalism on buses or whatever it might be, actually found it easier to apply situational methods than it was to, stop young yobbos being maltreated by their parents. Because, there was obviously a lot of people still do talk about root causes, but changing root causes, and this was always Ron's very, very strong belief, was a hide into nothing. It was just too difficult. Social inequality and deprivation was so entrenched in contemporary society that, leave well alone. And in any case, none of it had seemed to work very well at all in the past. I think that, what was it called? The word will come back to me in a minute. Early intervention. Early intervention was the only thing that latterly took hold. Now, I have to say, disbanded. It was disbanded 10 years ago, even though it was sort of showing some promise. But other than early intervention initiatives, everything else was really, really hard.
Yeah.
And so these crime prevention partnerships, in fact, took off the shelf many of the sort of situational crime prevention remedies and used those. So that embedded it in everyday approaches to crime prevention, and I would say they still are. The whole of the sort of crime drop debate has, to my mind, really come down to securitization as being probably the major factor in the crime drop. And that again, has given a boost to situational crime prevention.
Yeah. No, I agree with what Jan van Dijk said, was that perhaps situational crime prevention was victim of its own success.
Yes.
It proved so successful that it has been accepted. Now some measures that one could not imagine, like, for example, two football teams play and the supporters of one team cannot go to the stadium of the other. This sounds logic now, but it would have been unacceptable in the 60s. I remember reading an English book where the guy said hooligans do not exist. It was in the 60s. Hooligans do not exist in the UK because of our upbringing and our respect of things, and then everything changed, and then it's applied. The governments and the only measures that really give immediate success are these ones. So there is a part of academia that is still a little bit reluctant to that.
But I think in the late 70s, 80s, it seems quaint now, But one of the biggest challenges to it, apart from not tackling root causes, displacement, one of the main criticisms was that it would lead to a fortress society. This was before CCTV came in, and of course CCTV represented the fortress society. Well, I mean, it's just bizarre nowadays. We are surrounded by security. So the sort of fortress society criticism was very, very poorly placed, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the change in society, because I think society, especially for your generation, because you were there in the 60s, did you imagine that society would turn like it turned, and we would be having the debates now in 2023 that we are having about freedom of speech, this kind of stuff?
I can't say I ever thought about it. I was too much of the moment to think 50, 40 years ahead.
And I have the impression that we went back to some debates that maybe were 50 years old, and we are going back to this kind of stuff. I'm just a little bit worried about that. And one thing, so working for the government, some of the critiques, for example, were talking about administrative criminology, blah blah blah. But was there any pressure? How did you decide the measures that you were testing or applying?
Well, it was, I think what I probably haven't emphasized enough was that although we were within the Home Office, the research unit was very much independent. It had its own research program. It decided what it was going to do. I mean, 2 or 3 decades later, that totally changed. And whoever remained, not many of them, were told what to do. But at that time, we had, in fact, a very long leash. We also had the control of our own research budget. The research unit had its own budget, and it could decide on what funds it would give to outside academics. And so it was a slightly uneasy relationship in that we held the purse strings. But on the other hand, we always went to great lengths to involve the sort of outside community. We had, for instance, an annual research program conference where outsiders could come and say, you shouldn't be doing that, you should be doing the other. So there was an awful lot of independence. So no one was telling us what to do. And as I've said before, this whole idea of physical crime prevention, environmental crime prevention, situational crime prevention, as it became, was resisted. We were not told to do it. We asked to do it ourselves.
I've been following this series in Netflix, The Crown. There you see that the Queen sees a lot of prime ministers passing. And you stayed 37 years, you also saw a lot of prime ministers passing there. So indeed it was later, it was in the 90s that things changed a little bit.
Crime prevention partnerships coming in changed the scene a lot because they were held to account. The target culture came in the 90s. You couldn't move for targets. You could not move for targets. And so what was then the Research and Statistics Development, RDS, became more instrumental in measuring whether these targets were being met. And from my point of view in relation to the crime survey, it changed the crime survey tremendously. Whereas before, the direction of the crime survey, what we put in it, pursuing sort of theoretical lines, not always very successfully, but we had control of what went into the content of the questionnaire. When the target culture came in, we had to divert a lot of the questions to measuring whether fear of crime was going up or down, whether confidence in the police was going up or down, whether confidence in the courts was going up or down. It was actually Theresa May, I think, relatively, I couldn't put a date on it, who got rid of targets.
Yeah, but you see, that's the point, because usually people think that everything went wrong with the conservative governments. But when you look at what was going on, it was more the progressive government that paid more attention to this kind of stuff. Huh?
The target performance management and came in definitely with the Conservatives. That is not to say that the Alternative Labour Party doesn't like targets as well. Everybody likes targets.
Okay.
And funnily enough, they're just coming back into the frame a bit. I mean, the very, very, very big change came when Tony Blair got in 97, and that led 99, I think, to the crime reduction programme. And this was a very, very big deal. So he basically said, OK, you can do anything you want to prevent crime as long as it's fully evaluated and you can show me whether it works or doesn't work. It was an enormous, enormous enterprise. So all the people in universities who were always, of course, scratching around for money had having money thrown at them. In fact, the country ran out of criminologists. It ran out of criminologists. There was so much work that was out there for grabs, with billions and millions of pounds attached to it, that they they weren't allowed by their employers, I think, in the universities to turn their nose up. Some of the evaluators were reluctant evaluators. They didn't want to be too drawn in. On the other hand, by and large, criminology is more left-wing than right-wing, and therefore, what Tony Blair was trying to do had some appeal. I mean, I could go on forever about what happened to the crime reduction programme, which was rather sad, really. They pulled the rug under it after about 3 years. It was meant to last for 10 years, but it didn't. And the evaluations of the programme and the implementation and the way that it operated has been written about extensively and not very flatteringly.
Yeah, but you can go forever because we have the time. It's not like a radio program where they say stop now. So we have the time. You can say whatever you like, and then if you don't want, something you don't like, we can edit it. But there is no limit here. No, but I'm surprised about the fact that it's Blair that started with tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. But if you look at the time frame, in the UK, the crime drop started before that. Started a little bit like in the United States. It's different in continental Europe, but it was since the beginning of the 90s.
Well, it started most evidently first in the US and in Canada. Canada lagged a tiny bit behind America, but not by very much. And the drop was starting to be evident in about 1993 in England. It's hard to know, though, because when countries came in onto the Act, because the crime measurement vehicles in Britain were particularly good, with the crime survey and reformed police statistics, reformed at that stage anyway. So you were able to track what was happening to ordinary property crime quite well, but it was certainly later than the States. I can remember when Michael Howard was Home Secretary, and he was very, 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 very much into prison works. And one of his big arguments was, look at America. They lock everybody up, and I can remember one occasion when I was asked to brief him. I'd just come back from America, so I was sort of Miss America, had my Miss America hat on. And so anything that was to do with North America, I tended to get asked about. And the Attorney General of the United States was coming over, and he was having dinner with Michael Howard, was to have dinner with Michael Howard. So I was asked to give him some sort of leads, conversational leads. He was giving a sort of semi-formal address, and it was very early in the 90s. And one of the things the Attorney General was saying was that they'd had to put so many people in prison because crime was totally out of control in America. And I can remember saying to Michael Howard, well, it's sort of not true. Crime's going down. Crime's going down in America. Anyway, he was not to be shifted from his prison works. But one of the amazing angles, really, on the crime drop in America and Canada is that Michael Howard wanted to, when he finally took on board the fact that crime was going down, he wanted to pin that on the fact that prison population was going up. But the crime drop in Canada was almost exactly the same, with no commensurate increase in the prison population at all. And I don't think that fact was recognised enough for many, many years, even if it is recognised now. I mean, Canada's got so much more in common with America than we have, and yet their criminal justice policies are really rather different.
Yeah, I remember, I think you were there too, in 1999 at the Toronto ASC conference, where Alfred Blumstein presented the first edition of his book on the crime drop.
Yeah.
And Rosemary Garner was there and said something like, this is a joke that we make also in the Americas. We always say it from Mexico. Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States. But it can apply also to Canada. And she said something like that, you never pay attention to us, but we had the same thing, and the prisons are not increasing. And that led to the second book, the second edition.
If you look at the first book, Blumstein's first book, Canada isn't even in the index.
It's quite incredible. But I think, then when with the work of Graham Farrell, they recognize the role of situational crime prevention, because I think in the UK at least, the work of the Home Office in situational crime prevention is responsible for some of this change.
I think there are two different themes. I think the whole thing about the crime drop is one thing. All right, one factor might be securitization. But I think that the sort of trajectory of situational crime prevention isn't anything to do with the crime drop, really. I mean, the astonishing thing about the crime drop is that it was so evident in so many countries. It was a phenomenal thing, I think. I mean, criminologists had spent however many decades trying to explain why crime had gone up, and they were totally foxed. Well, they sort of didn't even see it for many years. It was only really, after 2000 that people sort of started to recognize that crime was going down. It was so unusual. They got so used to talking about crime going up. And I mean, I think it's fascinating as to what was behind it. I mean, there's a book that came out, it's up there, it's too far for me to read it. And I, after having gone to Australia and New Zealand, I did a chapter in it on whether crime had dropped in Australia and New Zealand. It was very hard for statistical reasons to say, because the measures weren't good. It was certainly later than in Western Europe. So we've got the States and Canada first, we've got Western Europe second, then Australia and New Zealand, it dropped after that, and not by as much, but it was hard to tell by how much it had dropped.
And what is your hypothesis? for the crime drop?
Securitization, and I think my own feeling was youth ideology. Whereas everybody wanted to rebel and make a fuss and stir up things, they all now want to go to university and make lots of money. So I think that a lot of if you think of a circle, you've got a hard core of offenders at the middle who are going to carry on. But at the periphery, you've got youth who were more drawn into risk-taking in this sort of 60s and 70s, and then gradually have become more materialistic and not more law-abiding, but more sort of selfish. The anecdote I always give about my own family is my daughter, who was always a bit of a rebel, but my son, he was boringly conventional. He never got into trouble. And he sort of epitomised this sort of youth ideology of the 90s, the 80s, and late. Well, he was born in 80, so we're talking about late 90s now. That they were very individualistic. They wanted money. They wanted cars and nice careers and nice trainers and things like that. I once wrote. I can't remember whether I wrote it or gave a lecture, and I was talking about the crime drop, and I famously said, and it was picked up unfortunately, that the youth of Europe were too stoned to have time to this was a time of increasing cannabis use, so they were too stoned to go out offending. They were all locked up in their bedrooms. I think it's fascinating, and I think demography played a little bit of a part. I think better policing played a bit of a part. The way I always used to approach it to give myself credit, was drawing more attention in the 90s to the crime drop than a lot of other people. And what I always used to do as my sort of go-to presentation was to put up all the factors that criminologists had long spun out as the reasons for increasing crime. You know, bad parenting, more working mothers, and so on and so forth, lack of social cohesion, and so on. And then if you turn, as I used to like to do, to turn those explanations, I think I had a list of about 10. If you turn them all on their head, all of them were going in exactly the same direction or had got worse, like educational standards had got better. So, you know, the idea of poorer educational standards as being a cause of increasing crime, but then we had improved educational standards, but we had lowering crime. And I got left with a sort of list of, I think 4 things that I said could play a part. 1 being securitization, 1 being slightly better policing, 1 being demography a little bit, and then this notion of changing youth ideology being the 4th.
Yeah, it's funny because Steven Pinker arrives many years later and takes some of these ideas. And yeah, it's funny how some ideas, when some people have more effect when they say things, because I remember you saying this, and you were on the front line because you were conducting the crime survey, so you could see what was going on. But at that time, it did not receive enough attention. Even when you got the Stockholm Prize, they mentioned especially your work on situational crime prevention, but the part of the crime survey, which is a major issue also because you are also involved in the International Crime Victim Survey, did not deserve so much attention.
No. Well, the crime survey now is not within the Home Office. It was taken out of the Home Office, as was police recorded crime, in 2014, and it was put over to the Office of National Statistics. And now the big change about 4, 5, perhaps even 6 years ago was the statistics badge was taken away from police recorded crime. So they are not now official statistics. The only official statistics on crime comes from the crime survey.
Yeah, that's a major issue. That was related because this is a very specific UK thing, because I remember when they told me we lost the badge of being national statistics, and that was like a disaster. Eh? It's not easy to understand it from outside, but it's some sort of quality label, that if you're doing it in the right way, then you get this label and you can lose it. And they found a lot of inconsistencies in the statistics, and that is why the badge was lost.
Yes, but I'm not sure that it makes a huge difference to the man on the street. Press releases on crime still refer to the police recorded statistics as much as they do at the crime survey, perhaps a bit less. But people, are still taking their messages from what the police statistics say. When they're released every 6 months, there's more caveats around them. Sort of sexual offending is up, but this is due to changes in police recording practices. But I think people will still look to police statistics to tell them what they think they should need to know.
Well, now the reports that are made by England and Wales include the crime survey as the main indicator. It's only one of the few countries to do that. If not the only one. And there is one thing that I would like to mention. So we usually don't focus in the persons that are interviewed, but in what happened in the country, as we've been doing. But there is something that I must mention here because it's not well known. You mentioned this difference on youth, how youth were not really not interested in maybe in social change, and perhaps the idea that most of the people have of you is someone who works in the home office, close to let's say close to the government. But then I discovered that when you mentioned at the beginning the other day of this interview that you had doing some humanitarian work. I remember you told me that you were in Argentina in the 60s. And this is something that, nobody talks about that. I think it changes the images. For me, I remember because you mentioned, I saw a documentary on TV. You told me that maybe 10 years ago. And I saw Formosa, and it was so depressing because it was in the same state as 40 years ago. Then I didn't know at all that you have been there. And the coup d'etat happened at that time. Maybe you can mention that because it's a very nice thing.
I would have to be much more prosaic. First of all, it wasn't really humanitarian. I just graduated and I went into the London School of Economics to pick up my post, and I saw a poster saying they wanted a demographer, and one of my papers had been a demographer. It wasn't a humanitarian expedition, it was more social development. And I had got a boyfriend at the time who wasn't playing ball. So I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll take myself to the other side of the world, and that'll teach him. So what had happened was that the demographer, the real demographer, had dropped out of the expedition at the very, very last minute, and they were scraping around to try and find somebody. And the extent of my demographic skills was counting legs and dividing by two, frankly. So I went in a fit of pique. Actually, I'd always been interested in South America. That was my thing, and they were happy to take anybody who would put their hand up. And so we sailed. You didn't fly in those days. We sailed across to.
You sailed to Buenos Aires.
Yeah. Well, we didn't land in Buenos Aires, and we were there for 2 years, and it was really a low-cost housing project, because there was lots of indigenous people with very, very poor housing, and most of the people on the expedition were architects or town planners. We did obviously make some connections, a few of which we've kept up, and we subsequently, of course, learned a lot about the social turmoil but this was long after we left, really.
Yeah. But you had to leave because the situation changed? Okay.
No. The situation deteriorated about 3 years after we left. I think you can't embellish that story.
No, I will not. But it's a nice story. So you stayed more than 1 year there.
Just over. We all travelled around afterwards, because being there, that's what you did. And then I came. It put me off South America forever, for what it's worth. I had such terrible experiences, because it was like there were 10 of us and we all fell out. It was not very good conditions we were living in, and everybody's patience snapped. And we all went off in our own ways after we'd finished up the work we were meant to be doing. And we all sort of nobody quite wanted to go on the same itinerary, and me, being brainless, went on my own. And it was
on your own in the 60s.
Yeah. Okay. I went traveling on my own, and but I don't need to go into it, but it was not a good experience, and it's my own fault. I should have had more sense.
Wow, but because you were in you were not in the capital, but you were in Formosa, near the border. It's still, well, you know that. Yeah,
I was imprisoned. I was imprisoned in Bolivia for a week, but the prison was better than the local hotel, so I couldn't.
In prison because you didn't have your passport.
No. It was anybody who was. Anybody who wasn't South American was assumed to be American, and they didn't make much of a distinction. And it was just after Che Guevara had been.
Exactly, Che Guevara is the same time of Che Guevara. So you were.
No, he'd gone by then.
Really risk-seeking, eh?
But they let me go eventually. Walking across the tarmac, they gave me my passport back.
And they spelled you. That's so nice as a story. It's incredible. So you had to leave Bolivia. Yeah, of course. That was exactly the time of Che Guevara.
Yeah.
Well, no, that's a wonderful story. It's
Well, anyway, I don't want to go back to South America. It put me off for life.
Yeah. Well, there are better places, safer places also to go in South America. But you chose the difficult ones. Okay, especially if you go by land, because you have to cross. Even at that time, really dangerous places.
Yeah.
Especially at the time of the guerrilla. Okay, that was. I just wanted to mention that because it's difficult to imagine this, and I think it's a wonderful story. What happened at that time, and so if we move a little bit to the crime survey, now there are two things that change a lot. Is the way to do it, but I think you were not doing it by phone even in the 80s. You were already going. Yeah. So that doesn't change a lot.
One of the ingredients of its success was that we did not change the methodology. But ironically, they have just put out a consultation post-COVID and trying to again rein in the costs of it, which is always an issue. And they are now probably going to change the methodology quite a lot. They're obviously very conscious of the risks of doing that. But it was really brought about by COVID because obviously they couldn't go into people's houses and interview them. And so they got off the ground admirably quickly a telephone survey. So they introduced a telephone survey. I think it was something like the May after the lockdown, the first May of the lockdown. So very, very, very quickly. And of course, people's attitudes to being interviewed at home are changing. I mean, people are so much more accustomed now to being interviewed in other ways, and with mobile phones and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So they've just done a consultation, and it looks as though there will be fairly big changes in the methodology. So what will happen down the line is up for grabs, really.
Yeah, but that will change also the historical series, because also the use of computers. Jan mentioned that from what he saw, people being interviewed by through a computer, or let's say feeling, the questioner in the computer sometimes tend to exaggerate what happened.
Well, there's computer-assisted telephone interviewing, which is basically the questionnaire is programmed for the interviewers, and that came in. I think we were the crime survey was the very first big national survey to introduce CATI, and then of course there was lots and lots of justified questioning about how far, if you asked a woman how often her husband had beaten her up, or how often she'd had her skirt groped, how accurate the answers would be. I think that was a justifiable criticism. So we then introduced CASI, which is computer assisted self-interviewing, again very, very early on. It was tested fairly thoroughly, and it's remained ever since the mid 1980s. It's been the sensitive questions on domestic abuse, sexual victimization, lifetime sexual abuse, stalking is done by CASI. I don't know the overall consensus about it. It's dirty data. A lot of people actually can't cope with the computer, although I think that's probably less so now. But when we first introduced it, people weren't used to tapping things into a keyboard, and so they often sort of didn't do it very well. I haven't myself heard a huge amount of criticism of it as a methodology. I'm surprised you say so. I mean, it's now very common, isn't it, for sensitive questions?
No, that's why I wanted to talk about it, because discussing with Jan, there was this issue: is it increasing artificially the rates or not? And then for that you need to to have to do a good comparison, and in many cases the rates were very low when we were comparing. So I think
my own feeling is that it's the questions that are wrong, because on the sort of normal domestic violence scales, I'm a domestic violence victim. I can tell you I'm not. But I've known Roger in exasperation throw something at me. They're enormously difficult questions to ask, obviously, but I have a bit of a bee in my bonnet about the questions on domestic violence and sexual victimization, because you can say yes to such a lot of the things perfectly, truthfully, but you are not, in your own imagination or in anybody else's imagination, a victim of, whatever.
Yeah, it's difficult to understand why. Sometimes I have the impression that they want to get high figures just to, and I don't know which is the real goal about that, because now the laws have been changed everywhere. I don't really get, especially with these questions that are prepared to be used as a scale, but then they are used separately. Like, for example, your husband or your wife wants to know all the time where you are, which is very difficult to the interpretation. I mean, if he or she is never interested in where I am, that would be also
worrying.
Exactly. So also the fact that the computers are so accessible and anyone can take a question and then make an analysis and say, wow, look at this, 80% are victims. Maybe the peer review system is not working in some cases, but in any case, it is a problem. I remember when we did that research in 2009-10 with you, Jan, John van Kester, and Antonia Linde for the European Victimization Survey. I remember very nice discussions we had about the questions, because the idea of developing the crime survey, how did it arrive in the 80s when you introduced it?
It was the World Society of Victimology, which Jan might have mentioned last week, and I think it was their second conference, and it was in Munster. And I had done some evaluation of defensible space, and I went to that conference and I gave a paper on defensible space, and this was 1979. No, 79 I think was the first conference. I was in 1980, and there were lots of Americans there, and they were talking about what was then called the Crime Victim Survey, the CVS. It's not now called that. And I was bowled over. This was the first airing that a victimization survey had ever had, in my mind, to my knowledge. And I thought, oh, you should have one of them. That's nice. And I went back, and in 1981 were the first riots, and Willie Whitelaw was the Home Secretary, and these were the first inner city riots, including one in Lozells, which is where I was actually born, so it had some salience to me. And suddenly crime was on the agenda in a way that it had not been before. Again, it is not true to say that anybody wanted us to do a crime survey. It was very, very much the opposite. Ron and Mike Huff and I put forward the case for a crime survey to show what crime was like and how it affected victims. And it wasn't all about, street riots. And it fell, again, like situational crime prevention had done, it fell on very, very, very stony ground. But fortuitously, William Whitelaw, he saw a little bit of a chink of light there, because, it showed that the Home Office was doing something about understanding crime. And there was a big conference in Cambridge in April 81, Easter 81, when they brought over lots of the big guns from the American survey, and they made the case. They said how they were using it and what it could do, and and before we knew it, we had got the go-ahead, and that was very, very interesting, because we got the go-ahead in something like August or September, and the methodological thinking at that time was that you had to have a recall rate of the previous year. The Americans actually had 6 months, but nobody else could afford a 6-month recall period. It was too short. And so it had to go into the field early in 1982. So we were faced with devising this instrument in the matter of months, in a matter of well less than 6 months. And so again, nobody in the policy divisions had a clue about questionnaire development. We didn't very much, but we had a bit more of a clue than them. We had a very, very, very good survey company working with us. And so the groundworks of the survey was in that mid 1981 to beginning of 1982 period. We also, and credit due to Mike Huff here, we also were absolutely adamant that we would get the results out quickly, because there was so much hostility to the usual criminological research, where a research report came out 6 years later and everything had moved on. So we were very, very intent on getting the results out, which we did, which helped. Didn't help, of course, that it showed there was 4 times more crime than the police were recording. But, you know, we prepared the ground quite well. So we were just very lucky. It was just a series of historical accidents, really. But that's where I can remember coming back and almost sort of, you know, running from the plane back to the Home Office saying, we should do a crime survey. But Ron would have known about it, of course, because he'd been exposed to American criminology.
But in any case, it's also a good point for the importance of conferences. One tends to underestimate how they put people together, and then many times when you discuss with people, they say, yeah, I was at the conference there and I found that, because I don't know if it is because you're outside of your normal environment, maybe ideas flow better, but a lot of these things come from of these projects. Also, you were also involved in the International Crime Victim Survey. That was a little bit later, but you were almost in all waves. You were co-author of the books. Huh?
I was involved right from the beginning, before it was done. The Research and Documentation Centre in The Hague, which is where Jan was doing a victim survey, and Jan and I met in the context really of a victim survey field. So he knew that I was doing the British crime survey. I knew he was involved in the Dutch one. And I can remember going to Barcelona with him, trying to co-opt the Spanish into the very first survey. So I was involved, but in fact, it was not part of my formal job description. I sort of did it on the side. Latterly, it was allowed to be part of my job, but not really for about 10 or 12 years. Of course, again, there was a bit of ambivalence to it within the Home Office, and the first set of results, not only for poor Jan, showed the Netherlands as having the most property crime, but we were very close behind. So that didn't go down very well. But it was not a lot of money. The samples, as you know, were very small. By this time, people had come to recognise that other modes of international comparisons were faulty in many, many respects. So at least it offered something, and it was quite novel. I stayed involved with it for many sweeps, but as I say, not really as part of my Home Office job.
Yeah, and this is, I would say, let's say funny, but in any case, you did it on your spare time. Also, Jan forced a little bit things to do it, Martin Killias. So it was a group of researchers that have maybe more freedom than now someone would have working for the Home Office. And even at the Center for Documentation in the Netherlands, I know that later they were much more keen on which are the projects in which you are working, and using their spare time to produce science. That is why I was surprised that this is not taken into account more often.
Well, I was interested in the project for its own sake. I enjoyed working with Jan enormously, but I was also just pretty sort of bolshy. I thought, you're not going to stop me. You're not going to stop me using my spare time exactly as I want to. Thank you very much. So there was never any really big issue. But the Home Office didn't support the International Crime Survey, other than me in my spare time and the amount of money it paid for its own sample. But Jan's involvement and achievement in relation to the crime survey is immeasurably more than mine, because he was so well connected. I would have had no idea who you'd write to in wherever, Spain or France or Poland, but Jan had the connections, and Jan was a very good administrator and a better bureaucrat than certainly I was. So I mean, it was his endeavours really that got so many countries to come on board in the first sweep, and then of course it had novelty value, and after the first sweep, it was easier to get other countries to come in, because the other country would say, "Oh, I wonder where I stand relative to the Netherlands."
Yeah, but you see, that is also, I mean, for us it's very interesting to compare, but for the countries sometimes it's not so good, because the questions were not the same, and I remember that
they were the same. No, that's not true. I think latterly countries deviated a bit from the questionnaire. They always thought, I can ask that question better than it is, but it was not true at the beginning.
It was basically the same question as the.
It was exactly the same questionnaire, and it was only much later towards the. I mean, after I don't even know what's happening to it now. I was going to Google it actually this morning. I forgot. But no, it was exactly the same questionnaire, and you could see deviations, because we got the data, and Jan van Kesteren and I would, analyze the data, and you could see if it was a different question. It just wouldn't go through the SPSS program. Yeah.
Now, what happened is, after the wave of 2004, 2005, for example, the rates in the UK crime was going down, but when you look at the survey, it was quite high still compared to the rest of Europe.
I thought Eurostat never went forward with that survey.
Exactly, it was stopped there, and you were no longer there, I think, at the Home Office. But there was I mean, the problem is crime is going down, but still we have much more crime than other countries, and that cooled down a lot the interest of the countries that had their own crime victim survey, and that is why in 2009-10 we did that project for Eurostat, and we were all sure that in 2013 we would have the European victimization survey, and at that time we thought, it's too late, 2013, it should be done before. But then at the Parliament, it was blocked by a representative of the UK. And
well, that was my gossip, that it was blocked by somebody in the UK. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So in the interview with Jan, he mentions exactly. I think maybe the name of the person too, or the party he or she was affiliated. But that blocked a lot the work, and also I think nowadays it's much more difficult to motivate a young scholar, for example, to enter in a project like that, because it does not produce immediately papers that can be published and that would help him or her to get a position. I mean, you invest a lot and you don't see the result immediately. For example, I've been collecting data from every country for years, and now I want to create a big database. It's very difficult to find money for that, because, you have no hypothesis. You are just doing a service to the society, putting all this together, And nowadays it's not so easy. We tried with Jan to recreate a group, but it's not so difficult. This generation of researchers that were like you, Jan, Martin Killias, putting together people is not so easy nowadays to find similar profiles. So maybe I was unable to find them.
By way of an aside, I don't think that Eurostat survey would have worked anyway, because if you remember when we were in Luxembourg, wasn't it?
Yeah.
There was so much dissent about the questions and about the questionnaire, and some of the countries specifically said they wouldn't abide by the suggested question, they'd ask something else. And and once that happens, once the questions deviate, well, you're onto a hide into nothing. And that was what was very, very singular about the ICBS, is that the questionnaire, for good or bad, was exactly the same.
Yeah, but for that you need a group of researchers working together and maybe knowing that they will be publishing about that 3 years later. And that is not so easy. And that brings me to the second question about the survey, which is cybercrime, because in my opinion, another factor for the crime drop is not only the ideology of youth, but also that with the beginning of the video games in the 80s, and then the internet, then the time you spend, the way in which you spend the time has changed a lot.
Yeah.
And this increase. So on the one hand, you have less kids in the streets, but connecting through the internet, and also all these online crimes, and it's not so easy to measure with the crime survey, or maybe.
Of course it isn't. I mean, the British Crime Survey does have measures of cybercrime, but they don't touch it really. I mean, you're getting a lot of virtually everybody is computer hacked and will have their information misused in some way or other. I haven't worked it out. I mean, initially there was this idea that those younger men who would shoplift or break into a warehouse or something would turn to internet crime or cybercrime because it was easy. It just didn't wash with me. They could barely get out of bed, let alone defraud people over the computer. But I don't know. I mean, it may be that they have skills, but the complexion of it is changing so fast and in so many different directions. I mean, I don't think criminology is keeping up at all. I haven't heard any convincing sort of criminological discussion about what's happening. I was scammed last week. I have a bank account which I only use for paying 3 utility bills because I get cash back on them. I never use it for anything else. And there were 3. I tried to log in because I just wanted to keep an eye on it, and I couldn't get in. I was blocked out. Didn't worry. I tried again a couple of days later and couldn't get in. And I rang up the branch, and there'd been 3 transactions. Probably, they thought, an American travel aid. It was tourism. They didn't know what it was, but there were 3 transactions out, and bizarrely, 1 refund back in, which I think was the thing that alerted the security. And I said, look, I've never, ever made any transaction except paying the electricity bill and the water rates. I got the money back, and it wasn't particularly upsetting. But where did that come from? Who was doing that? How did they do it? Just bizarre.
Yeah. And this is a big challenge, and also for the measure of crime, it's very difficult because, as you mentioned, computer malware or junk email. I mean, it's constantly.
Yes.
But I remember you also mentioned somehow, maybe in one of your papers in the 80s, that the modern societies should learn to live with a certain amount of crime.
Well, a lot of people think that, I think, yeah. Well, it's just it's part of the tapestry of life, isn't it? I mean, it's not
exactly. And now it's even more important because now it's constant. that's life. It works like that, and we have accepted also because we buy antiviruses and we buy that is completely private security. But in any case, and this is one question that we like to ask when we have covered more or less all the topics, is how crime has changed during your lifetime. If you have to think about that, if you have to give your opinion about that.
Well, obviously, cybercrime, internet crime, whatever, in its various forms, that's been. I mean, no one would have seen that coming. No one could have seen it coming. There was more hooliganism, I think, in the 60s. This is going back to what I said before about youth being better behaved in funny sort of way, or less risk taking, or have less aggro. I mean, it's still evident in relation to football, for instance, and in relation to sort of rioting to a certain extent. But I think there's probably less than that. I have no idea, and I rather doubt whether domestic violence has become worse or sexual victimization has become worse. For my own part, I don't believe it has. I just think it's more attention is paid to it. I don't know. I haven't got anything very profound to say, except that one would never have predicted that burglary and car theft would have gone down and been replaced by economic cybercrime. It's interesting. I got the money back for that last week one, and I had a similar one a couple of years ago, for which I again got the money back. And from the point of view of victims who are defrauded of money, if they get it back, what's the harm? Obviously, some people get incredibly worried about it. From this, on my bank account last week, I can't say I was ever worried. I made the assumption that I would get it back, and I made the assumption that I would never understand what had happened. And I think I made the assumption that the security people at the bank would never understand what had happened. Yeah. In a way, it was sort of water off a duck's back.
Yeah, we could think in that way also. It's like someone bumps into your car, the car is repaired, and then you go on. But that requires a change of the way of thinking, and some people do not realize that. Well, something that also happened before. You don't realize that you're a victim because if you don't check your account, you don't know what happened. So that is also a problem. And also maybe the profile of the offenders change a lot. If you read texts of the 70s, usually the offenders are working class, poor people, and this also is a huge change. Also, if you look at the composition of the prison population.
Well, you've got the ethnicity angle on that. I mean, the ethnic composition of the population has changed a lot, and of course, given the discrimination, the makeup of the prison population now would be incredibly different to what it was in the mid-60s. But going back to my previous point, I don't believe the sort of fairly illiterative, dishevelled youth who might have committed a minor burglary would somehow turn to cybercrime.
No.
I find it hard.
Yeah. But maybe the problem also is maybe in the 70s, the measures of crime were not good. So maybe the idea of what was going on is wrong because the measures were mainly who is in prison, and we know that this indicator is not very good, and maybe some police statistics, but the real thing is very difficult to know what was going on at that time until you started doing, for example, the crime survey, and for many countries even today it's very difficult to know exactly what was going on. So that's also a challenge for criminology. But there are much more criminologists, but I'm not sure that there is much more theoretical development. You mentioned the difficulties of introducing theories, and it's still, I think, the same problem. Yeah, it's really very interesting because you mentioned so many things that people don't know about it, and especially how this was done through a government agency. It's quite unique. It's UK, well, US also, and the Netherlands mainly.
Well, the Australian Institute of
Australian, yeah,
is a bit similar.
Yeah, you were in Australia and in New Zealand, in both countries, and there you also worked on the on victimization surveys.
Oh, tell me about it. I'd gone to Australia and I came back. They didn't know what to do with me, and I was put into a sort of troubleshooting role, which was very, very I mean, it was nasty having to tell young researchers that they designed their studies wrong, and the report was blessed awful. I had been invited to go to, it was the Institute of Criminology in Wellington, before, when my daughter was a teenager, and she put her foot down and was not going to go. And so we finally didn't go, but I'd always kept an eye on it. And I was finally sort of headhunted. They had a vacancy and they couldn't fill it. They knew that I had at one stage been speaking to them about going, so they invited me to apply for directorship of something called the Crime and Justice Research Centre, which was it was within the Institute of Criminology, but it was its own thing, and we had to raise our own money. And I went in October 2004, and I was just sort of putting my feet under the table when a invitation to tender came through, and within 2 weeks of my getting there, the invitation to tender for the New Zealand Crime and Safety Survey. They'd done it before. They wanted to do it again. And of course I just had to get it. There are no criminologists in New Zealand at all, really, and none with the sort of, survey methodology, criminological survey methodology skills that I was able to bring. So within and of course it was an enormous amount of money for the centre. I mean, obviously we paid most of it out to the survey company, but it didn't matter. It was the size of the grant that mattered. So I got an enormous number of brownie points for getting this, contract. And I thought, I didn't come all the way to New Zealand to do another national crime survey. And of course we were there 4 years, and we had an absolutely great time, but a lot, my time was 90% taken up with the crime survey.
With the crime survey, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, that's
but it's still going on, the New Zealand survey.
Well, it's a long story. They'd done 3 other surveys before the one that I was involved in, and each of them had been different, fairly radically different. And so they were quite prepared for me to redesign it, because there was not much continuity. So I redesigned it more along the lines of the British Crime Survey, trebled the survey count of crime in doing so. And after I left, they've changed it again. Yeah. No, well, they've done it. I do beg your pardon. It's been done, as I understand it, twice. The first time they didn't change it very much, but they changed it sufficient to not have confidence in the trend. And then I was asked to advise on another redesign for the last survey, which I did, and that was dramatically different. So I haven't seen any results from that though.
Okay. So, but you brought the good news everywhere, and in Australia you were also involved in that, in something like that.
Oh, I did farm victimization surveys, and I did retail stores, but counting the number of sheep who were stolen made a change.
In Australia. Because they had relatively high rates of violence, I remember, in Australia when comparing with the ICVS, and that was a major a difference that was difficult to explain. Eh?
Yes, it was a bit difficult to explain. Yeah.
Okay, so I think, Lieven, I talk too much. Maybe it's me.
I think, but basically we want to ask the same question. So
yeah, okay.
We managed to cover all things. I think we learned a lot about the problems of comparative surveys, the importance of it. So I hope a new generation of scholars will get their interest in conducting surveys using highly qualitative methodological standards, which is really important. So I think this interview will be a very interesting guide towards
okay, well, I've enjoyed it.
Research.
Thank you very much, but thank you very much. Thank you for following Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast. This podcast is edited by Eduardo Coco from the University of Lausanne. Our theme song is Seagull's Night, Noche de Gaviotas, composed by Gustavo Cantero, arranged by Tato Germano, and played by Tato and Gustavo with the voices of Sasha Conte and Alejandro Turco Guyot. Your host are Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium, and Marcelo Evi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland. Cheers, and see you soon.